This week, we're going to be looking at two topics which may have more to do with the literary side of Scripture than with its historical side. These two topics are narrative criticism and the allegorical method. Let me explain first why I am including them here. First, narrative criticism. A large part of the Bible is historical narrative. I've read estimates ranging from 40 to 70% of its entire contents. The exact percentage doesn't matter. The point is, it is helpful to have some basic rules for dealing with narrative if we are to understand the Scriptures. That's why I believe narrative criticism can give busy pastors a huge assist as they prepare texts for preaching and teaching. Most of the so-called rules are just common sense and go all the way back to Aristotle's Poetics. Most of them have been implicitly used by skilled interpreters ever since Luther re-emphasized the historical meaning of the Bible. Luther himself was a master, even though he may not have used any of the technical terms narrative critics use. Any accomplished reader, schooled in the art of understanding authors of fiction and nonfiction, knows how to do this. One of the reasons why our fathers wanted to maintain a liberal arts degree as a prerequisite for entering the seminary was so that young men could be schooled in reading the foothills of secular literature before moving on to the vast mountain range of Scripture. I personally would lament it if our MLC students got the impression that acquiring the biblical languages was the only reason for their attending the college. Schooling in history and literature are equally important, teaching students what to do with those basic tools of Greek and Hebrew. By the way, just to forestall any misunderstanding, the word criticism does not mean we are being critical of the Bible or standing in judgment over it. A more descriptive way of talking about what we're doing might be practicing discernment in interpreting scriptural narrative by applying common rules for understanding it. It might be worth it at this point to answer a possible objection that someone could level against using the techniques of narrative criticism. Some might say that using techniques which had their origin in the interpretation of fictional texts blurs somewhat the truth of the Bible. While I think this can certainly happen, I see no necessary connection. All writers of narrative, whether of fiction or nonfiction, use the same basic techniques: time, plot, characters, repetition, dialogue, setting, narrator's point of view. If I'm writing a historical biography about Ronald Reagan, I will use these techniques in telling Reagan's story if I want people actually to read what I'm saying. And the plain fact is, biblical histories were written as stories. That is to say, they were not attempts to recount merely the facts in a dry and colorless way. They make no claim to an objective point of view. This is a modernist notion, and quite to the contrary, the biblical historians wrote as prophets with a God's eye point of view. They were selective about what subjects they wrote, and they wrote about them with a purpose that is clearly discernible. So we look at the cycle of stories from Abram to Abraham or Joseph in Egypt as examples of this narrative art. So I don't believe that this procedure involves a necessary presupposition of doubt, or that in using it I'm conceding that the biblical text is fiction. But I will admit, and this will be a discussion point in the course, that many practitioners of narrative criticism have in fact treated historical sections as if they were simply made-up stories. Another danger in reading interpreters who adopt this approach is seen when those interpreters exalt the artistry of the holy writer above the veracity of the text itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's try to get a basic definition of narrative criticism in our heads. Narrative criticism of the Bible had its birth in the Bible as literature movement that followed the Second World War in America. Secular universities and colleges studied the Bible not for its theological content, but for its literary qualities as one of the great standard works of the Western world. Later, biblical critics, many of whom were weary of the atomizing and reductionistic techniques of classical historical criticism, began to apply literary methods to the analysis of the biblical text. Narrative criticism is interested in how a story works, how it achieves the effects that it does upon a reader. For many, it is an attempt to understand what the author meant by telling a story the way that he did, as well as what significance this may have for us today as modern readers. It is far superior to the old historical critical method for two reasons. Number one, it treats the text or the book as a unified composition written by an author who wanted to say something. And secondly, it practices a close and careful reading of the text, attending carefully to what the text is saying and how it says it in almost minute detail. If narrative criticism is a very helpful technique when applied to the historical sections of the Bible, the allegorical method is just the opposite, a classic procedure for misreading the text and mishandling the historical portions of the Scripture. Allegorizing is the practice of finding symbolic or spiritual meanings in a text or in a narrative when there is no warrant, either in the text or in the context, for doing so. It treats narratives, historical narratives included, as extended metaphors, often with every point in the story having a mystic significance, when those texts were never intended to be treated that way. We need to distinguish allegorizing from the biblical practice of seeing types and shadows in the Old Testament. Typology is the practice of seeing the divinely intended correspondence between an Old Testament entity and a New Testament reality. This correspondence is built on history and loses its meaning without a historical foundation. We also need to distinguish allegorizing from application. Application is a way of showing how a text applies to current readers in their current situation. The allegorical method was one that saw the historical events, dialogue, and narratives of Scripture as largely unimportant in themselves. They may have had some significance, but the real task was to get behind them to the deeper spiritual meaning. This meaning was often quite unrelated to the original historical meaning. In a way, you could think of it as allegory converts the hills and valleys, the rivers and streams of biblical narrative inhabited by real people encountering real struggles into a flat landscape where every feature is symbolic. The real world becomes a field of symbols. History is thus destroyed. And so this week we are dealing with two approaches to the interpretation of biblical historical narrative. One good, one not so good. To help you get into the study, we will follow our normal practice of assigned readings and discussion topics. I will also give you exercises to complete and hand in as individual assignments rather than as a discussion topic for groups. They will be rather easy and shouldn't take up too much time. I anticipate no more than 54 minutes apiece to complete. Due also this week will be your first text study as mentioned before. Finally, because I think the topic of narrative criticism will be of great interest to you, I'm going to add a few resources from the Internet which you can peruse on your own time. In other words, you don't have to read them if you don't want. You don't need to respond to them in any way. You can certainly ask questions about them, but I'm mainly putting them there to give you a greater depth of background into the subject. I will clearly mark them as additional resources.